Welcome everybody who's joining us. We're going to get started in about a minute and a half, just giving everybody else a minute or so to jump on the webinar with us.
Hello, everybody. Welcome, educators. It started about 5 seconds, but we actually just ran this webinar with over 151 educators in the Catholic school community. So we are very excited today to be exploring this unprecedented situation with you. We're also offering webinars throughout the day as well, and we're also going to be offering some tomorrow. And we also have some in the forecast for some more tool-based webinars. But my name is Mike. I will be a co-host today. With me is Aaron Saylor. We are both senior learning leaders at Eduscape. Eduscape is a professional development company where we really challenge educators to rethink learning by exploring creative options to instruction. Now, today our topic is shifting mindsets, exploring that roadmap to online learning for the K-12 classroom. Now, we're going to go through a couple logistics and then we'll dive into the content. But our focus today is really on what is the pedagogical approach to this online instruction. I'm sure you're receiving a ton of emails with all of the different tools, all of the different websites that are out there that are offering free memberships. And those are all great, but how do you use them in an effective way? So our agenda today is we're going to be looking at some online learning myths and talking about some facts as well. We're going to be looking at terms. You're diving into a kind of new territory for some of us. What do these terms mean that I keep seeing popping up? Planning. This is where the bulk of our content is going to come today. We're going to look for very step-by-step directions on how you can take your content and turn it into an online setting, as well as how to address this in an emergency situation that we're in. And then finally, we're going to finish off our day with some Q&A. We'll spend about 45 minutes in content and then about 10 minutes or so in questions, and we'll go over the logistics of that in just a moment. But we're going to be reviewing a planning tool to help you create your remote teaching model. We're going to be looking at practices, processes, and mindsets and really focus on shifting that mindset in this process to support an online learning environment. And finally, we're going to identify some very practical step-by-step directions on how to turn your instruction into the online setting. So a couple logistics today. At the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A button. Any questions that you have today, please post it in that section. You also do have the option to use the chat as well, but please note that any questions that are put in there will probably get lost. So please just put any of your questions in that Q&A section. And speaking of, as I'm kind of going through some of the logistics, please try to use the chat right now. Tell us where you're zooming in from. So tell us your city, your state, your country, wherever you might be. Go ahead and just drop that into the chat so we can see where everybody's from. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. Those recordings will be put onto Eduscape's website over the next couple days, so watch out for that as well. Your mic and your video is turned off for this particular webinar. So if you do have questions, you do need to use that Q&A tool. And then finally, at the very end, when we have those discussions, you'll also still be able to use that tool. So again, if you have any questions, use the Q&A. If you want to chat, share resources, whatever it might be, go ahead and drop that into the chat. And let's kind of have a conversation today about a teacher who is a high school teacher, but keeping in mind that what we're talking about is a high school example, but can certainly be translated to middle school as well as elementary school. And please ask us very specific questions for your grade level, and we'll address those as well. But in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, and we actually did not realize this when we chose this name, Mr. Jameson is a 10th grade history teacher at MLK High School. Unexpectedly, like many of you, his school closed down as a result of COVID-19, and his instruction has moved to online. Now he keeps getting emails about all these amazing tools, but again, he doesn't know where to even start. Those tools are great in theory, but let's just think about from a teacher's perspective, how do I even begin to consider transferring my content online? So he keeps thinking about online learning. It's easy, right? I just post articles and YouTube videos and call it a day. Okay. What are these online learning terms? Never had to know them. So what are they? And finally, how do I decide what to teach? What we're going to be looking at for the rest of this 45-minute period is how we can help Mr. Jameson shift his thinking on how to shift from an in-person instruction into online instruction. So let's explore some of those myths that he has when it comes to online learning, and let's dispel them. So for this particular activity, I'm going to launch a poll. The poll is going to say myth versus fact, and there are going to be 5 different statements. These 5 statements are either myths or facts. What I would like you to do, and I'm going to give you a couple seconds to do so, is to decide, is it a myth or is it a fact? Then what we'll do is we'll go back and we'll discuss which ones are myths and which ones are facts, as well as kind of extend our understanding of these different statements. So I'm going to launch the poll right now. If it doesn't automatically pop up for you, take a look down at the bottom toolbar to see if it pops up there. What we're going to do is I'm going to go read through the 5 different statements, and I'll allow you to answer or make your choices as we go. So number 1, online learning is harder for the learner. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a myth or a fact? So online learning is harder for the learner. So you should have a poll option pop up down at the bottom. If it's not popping up, please just let us know in the chat, because you know technology works great when it works great. So I'm seeing that the poll is not popping up. So let me try it one more time, team. And then if it doesn't work, we'll have you use the chat for that. Let's see. Is it popping up? There it is. Okay, so it must have just been a little technology glitch. There you go. Thank you, team. So online learning is harder for the learner. That's number 1. What are your thoughts on that? Is that a myth or is that a fact? Number 2, learners will look up answers online to complete assignments. Learners will look up answers online to complete assignments. Okay. Give you a second there. Now the polls are coming in. There it is. Number 3, online learning is as effective as face-to-face learning. Online learning is as effective as face-to-face learning. Number 4, online learning is impersonal and less engaging. It's impersonal and less engaging. Number 5, last but certainly not least, planning an online learning experience is similar to planning a face-to-face instruction. It's similar to planning face-to-face. So I'm going to give you about another 10 seconds or so. I know that some of the polls were just popping up. Go ahead and get your answers in there. I see that some people are posting questions in the Q&A, which is great. We will definitely try to continue to respond as we go through the webinar, as well as in the chat. So let's see, we're about 47, 48 votes. We're getting there. So let's kind of start diving into what your thoughts are on this, on these topics, on these myths. So let's take a look, Aaron. Let's look at number one. Number one, online learning is harder for the learner. That's a myth. But why is it a myth? Let's talk about it. Okay, so online learning really comes down to a few points, and it comes down to a few components. Number one, consider communication. Online learning can become very difficult if communication is not clear, concise, and consistent. When you are establishing new norms and new routines, transferring from a physical classroom to a digital one, let your students know, how often are you going to be communicating with them? Where should they be looking for that communication? And how will you communicate with them? So for example, if you're looking to post announcements every Monday, make it very clear to your students that that is your plan. Another component where students may find online learning harder as a result of some planning is those learning activities. Just because we post things online doesn't mean that students have access to them. So, and what I mean by that is not digital access, but is that cognitive access. We still need to consider how we scaffold online learning. We still need to consider how clear our directions are, how we offer support so that students are able to access that content in a meaningful way. Another component to consider is your management piece. How do you post assignments and how do you name those assignments? Are all homework assignments going to have HW at the beginning of them? Are classwork assignments going to have CW at the beginning of them? What does your file naming convention look like? Are we going to just post homework, homework 1, homework 2, or are we going to give it a title? Consider those naming conventions. Also consider using calendars. How can I give my students very clear scheduling supports so that they know when new information is coming out, as well as when they should complete their assignments by? Thinking about Google and Microsoft, there are a lot of technical abilities within those platforms that allow you to help your students stay on track. So number one is a myth, and it comes down to our planning, which we'll dive into a little bit today. So number two, learners will look up answers online. Yeah, they will. They have a resource available to them, but how can we use that resource to our advantage? When you're designing your assessments and when you're designing your activities, consider some of these, consider how you might create them such that those activities produce valid and reliable evidence of learning. In this case, is it about the content or how they use the content? Is it skill-based? And if so, how can we make sure that our assessments and our activities are actually telling us what we want it to tell us? Consider using quizzes as low stakes grades rather than high stakes. Maybe provide time for open book tests, letting them use their notes, but keeping it a shorter amount of time. If you have the ability to use video conferencing, maybe electronically proctor an exam so that students have their cameras on as they're taking the test. Now, will students find a way? Sure. As I used to tell my students, I taught for 7.5 years, I always used to say, use your powers for good. But remember, they're also navigating this situation as uncertain as you are. So the more that we can provide supports for our students and create assignments where they're demonstrating their knowledge in meaningful and authentic ways, the more that students, the better that we'll be off. And the online instruction will be more effective. So that brings us to number 3. Online learning is as effective as face-to-face learning. Well, that depends, right? So I have myth here only for this reason. It comes down to all of the things that I've talked about so far. How you plan is very important, and how you deliver that content is super important. So can it be effective, if not more? 100%. It just depends on how you organize and how you plan. Now, we're talking about 2 different types of planning today, right? So we're looking at planning when it comes to online planning in general, as well as planning when it comes to an emergency setting, which we are in. So for example, I forgot to share you the numbers. So on number 3, we had 64% that said fact and 36% that said myth. Honestly, the answer is kind of, right? It depends on how you organize and you plan. And we're going to dive into that planning aspect today. Number 4, online learning is impersonal and less engaging. So let's go to that next one, Aaron. I don't know. There it is. So 87% say it's a myth. 13% say that it's a fact. It's a myth. Think about how you can make your online community. If you're using video conferencing, how can you have students share? If you're having students take selfies every Friday to show their workspace or to show what they're working on, consider how you can take the student's physical working space and to bring it into a larger community. Have students ask questions on the post and carry conversations. If you're able to meet with students in smaller groups or larger groups, however you want to do so with video conferencing or teleconferencing, consider what you have available to facilitate that. Less engaging. Well, think about how we're engaging with this now with a poll. How can you bring students into conversations digitally? And how can they interact with each other? The more that you interact as well in this conversation, the better, because it legitimizes that online learning community. And number 5, planning an online learning experience is similar to planning face-to-face instruction. 68% say fact, 32% say myth. It is a fact, and this is why. We are all instructional designers that know our learning sciences, and we know how to create lessons. The biggest difference is how you deliver that instruction. So what we're going to really focus on today is what does planning look like when you're trying to plan online, number 1, but as well as when we're in this emergency scenario where some of that learning has to change somewhat. So let's see, did we change the mindset for Mr. Jameson? Okay, so he might be a little bit wrong about online instruction, right? So online instruction can be harder for the learner if my planning, digital organization, and communication are not clear. So consider that point. Learners may look up stuff online, so how can I assess their knowledge? And how I assess their knowledge needs to change slightly. Instead of just a recall of facts, it's an application of facts. Online learning can be effective if I provide my learners with the supports they need to access content. The biggest thing is determining for students when assignments are due, where to find assignments, and how to name those assignments on your digital platform. Online learning doesn't have to be impersonal or less engaging, especially if I use some of the tools I keep getting emails about. In other webinars not covered today, we're going to also explain how you can use Google and Microsoft to make your online learning more personal and more engaging. But also consider other tools like Flipgrid and even using Twitter to engage students in online learning. And oh, I already know how to plan face-to-face instruction, and planning for online learning is similar. But this is all happening so fast, so I do have to make some adjustments, which Aaron is going to talk about in a few minutes. So, Mr. Jameson, I think he's got it now. But what do the terms mean? Now that his mindset is starting to shift, what are the terms? Let's explore some of these online terms, learning terms. So if we look at those terms, so number 1, there is a bit.ly link there for you at the bottom, and I will drop these resources into the chat momentarily. Using that bit.ly link, you'll be able to download a PDF of this quick vocabulary list. So I'm going to briefly go through these. Asynchronous learning. Asynchronous learning is where the learner is completing work at their own pace. So if you're posting information online and let's just say you have a learning cycle of a Monday to a Friday, students can complete that work at any pace, any place, any time that they want, as long as they are meeting their deadlines. Authoring tools. Authoring tools are any tools you use to build, design, or create content for online learning. For many of us educators, those authoring tools are going to be things like Google Docs or Microsoft Word. But for some of us in an instructional design field, you might be using Camtasia or Adobe Captivate. So there's a lot of authoring tools out there. Use which ones you're comfortable with. Blended learning. It's an instructional format when we combine face-to-face instruction and online instruction. In our case, we could almost argue that when you're meeting with people video conferencing, it's a face-to-face instruction. In the traditional sense, it's literally meeting with them in a physical classroom. No matter what, blended learning is a combination of face-to-face and then online learning. Curation, you might have heard this in museums. Curation is collecting, researching, reviewing resources that might be useful in your learning experience. But what's the difference between researching and curation? Curation is pulling those things together, those articles, those videos together for a very specific purpose, to have the students walk away with a very specific learning goal. E-learning and online learning, those terms are synonymous just to indicate electronic learning. So we have a couple more terms. Instructional design. You are all instructional designers. It's using that learning science, that cognitive learning science, the stuff we learned in college, that stuff we use to teach kids, combined with digital authoring tools to create online learning experiences. Maybe many of you have heard this term LMS, a learning management system. Learning management systems are very simply the platform that you use to deliver instruction. Some have more features, such as the ability to grade, track grading, host virtual classes like we're doing right now. In some cases, your LMS is Google Classroom. Maybe it's Microsoft Teams. Maybe it's Schoology or Canvas. There's many different types of LMS, and it's all about how you use that LMS that will determine the effectiveness of our instruction. So we talked about asynchronous. Let's talk about synchronous. Synchronous instruction is what we're doing right now. We're all coming together and we're learning at the same time and through video chat. Speaking of video conferencing, it's the ability to use live video, audio, and at times chat to facilitate virtual instruction or meetings. Now, there are some things to consider when you're looking at video conferencing. For example, some districts and states limit actual video and may have to have students log on without showing their video or not recording. So please look at your district's policies when considering some of these different different tools. So now let's take a look at Mr. Jameson. He always wondered what an LMS stood for. So now that he realizes what these terms are, it's going to help him as he's doing some more research. So whether this is going to be 2 weeks, or this is going to be 2 months, or this is going to be the rest of the school year, Mr. Jameson has the tools that he needs to continue his research and start to transfer his instruction online. But I would also encourage you to explain these terms to your students. You may start to use this vocabulary and they may start seeing it in the different resources that they receive. Give them those definitions and it might help them along in their learning. Finally, decide if you want to meet asynchronously or synchronously with your learners. That communication is so important. And again, that really goes into what your districts are allowing you to do, as well as what tools you have accessible to yourself, as well as to your students. So Mr. Jameson says, I'm going to be professional ID in no time. So he's already using his new lingo that he learned. But now that he has the myths and his mindset changing, and now that he has the terms in his vocabulary, let's help Mr. Jameson identify how to decide what to teach online and the method of doing so.
In order to take his face-to-face instruction to the online learning community, we're going to follow Mr. Jameson as he goes through 6 tangible or very concrete steps to determine what he's going to teach immediately and what his continued instruction will look like for his online learning with his students. I just want to reiterate again through this process, we are going to use an example of a 10th grade global history class with 10th grade standards. However, this is a process of planning that can be applied to every single grade level from pre-K to 12th grade. It's just the content that will differ. At the bottom of your screens is the outline that mimics the same process or would help you follow the same process in your own planning in different formats, a PDF, a Google document, or a Word document, depending on the format that you are most comfortable with. We are going to highlight when opportunities to different grade levels can apply, but also send out an additional resource that shows what this outline could be done or would look like at different age levels as well. So early ed, a middle school, and the high school level as well, the exemplars. So we're going to follow Mr. Jameson through these 6 steps, and we're going to first look at step number 1, which is take inventory. At the take inventory stage, Mr. Jameson is going to think about the tools, the technology tools specifically that he has available to him or he knows and could easily access. So at this first step, it's thinking about what are the tools that I most commonly use and know how to use as well. It's a great time to explore different tech tools to help transition to this online learning, but it's also absolutely appropriate to stay within the tools that you most use in order to deliver instruction as soon as possible to students. After reflecting on the technology tools that you would normally have available to you or you're most comfortable using, you would also want to reflect on your content goals. So from now until the end of the year, what is the content that students need to cover in order to be able to progress to their next grade level? And starting to think about what is the immediate content that I need to start delivering to my students. I'm going to pause here for a second if you would like to take any notes. Again, these same steps and processes are listed on the organizer that was in that bit.ly link. So we are going to see what this looks like for Mr. Jameson's actual course of global history. Again, this is a concrete example of a global history 10th grade class, but this can be applied to your own grade level and subjects. So going through the first step of taking inventory, Mr. Jameson has thought about the different content that he needs to cover in his global history and was in his organizer bulleted out all of that information. So as we're going through this, think about the technology tools that you would have available. They could be your Google products, your Microsoft, or email, or whatever other tools that you use to support students in this online learning. Looking at step 2, which is to identify learning outcomes. So at this stage, it's most important to think about what is the non-negotiable or core learning that Mr. Jameson would need to take his students through and have exposure to in order to be successful for that next unit, as well as by the end of the year, so they're able to continue having quality educational experiences that help progress them to that next step. So for step 1 of this phase 2, Mr. Jameson's going to think about or review what his end of year assessment is and what any end of unit assessments may be. So those benchmarks that students need to be achieving in order to progress. From those end of year and end of unit assessments, thinking about what are those non-negotiable learning needs. Now this would be in the form of any standards or other benchmark standards for grade level. So for example, if you follow the Common Core standard, Next Generation Science standards, New York generation standards that they've come out with, or any other regional standards, if you're in Florida or Texas, or per grade level, if students are working through a particular curriculum and there are benchmarks within there, that is the benchmarks that would be translatable at step 2. After you've identified those non-negotiable standards or learning needs for students, you'll think about what are those actionable learning outcomes that students will work towards mastery. Then do a self-check between those learning outcomes you've created and the standards that you've chosen to ensure that all the learning outcomes you're planning your instruction around are aligned back to those standards in order to ensure that students are having the most focused and meaningful online learning experiences, so they are getting the information that they need and skill practice that they need to be successful. I'll pause here for another moment if you're taking any notes, and then we'll see what this looks like in Mr. Jameson's classroom with a concrete example. Now in Mr. Jameson's class, to go through this process, he's first going to think about his end of year assessment. For the 10th grade teacher, he's thinking about the state exam in global history that students need to take. If this was a younger grades, it would be whatever other performance benchmarks or assessments that they have that are relatable to them if a state exam is not applicable. Mr. Jamison's also going to think about his end of unit assessment. So for Mr. Jamison, he's already focusing on his next unit on World War I and had a performance task planned, but is unsure if he's able to deliver this whole or support students through this whole performance task because of how fast he needs to transition to the online community and doesn't have as much time as he expected for planning. Next, he's reviewing from his curriculum the standards that students are meant to achieve at this unit, as well as the learning outcomes that were written for this unit that students would be working towards. Now, Mr. Jamison is going to go through the process of looking back at his year assessment and determining which of these standards, learning outcomes, are most necessary for students to be able to achieve that end of year unit assessment, which is the state exam in global history. When reviewing his state exam in global history, Mr. Jamison realized that these 3 standards highlighted in blue are the ones that are being assessed on his exam. These are the learning outcomes that align to those 3 standards. Therefore, Mr. Jamison knows that these are the ones to focus on because they're what students will be assessed on at the end of the year, and knows those are going to be the most important standards and learning outcomes to plan his instruction around. When looking back at his end of unit assessment, Mr. Jamison realized there were 4 parts to this performance task. The parts of the performance task that are directly assessing these standards and learning outcomes are the first 2 parts that are highlighted in blue. These are the parts that he will ensure that students have an experience and have opportunities to practice and demonstrate when they're working towards completing their end of unit assessment, knowing that the other parts, in this case, can become extension or added in as time permits. It is absolutely possible to complete this entire end of unit assessment in an online learning platform, but since we're in a unique situation where we're transitioning very quickly from the classroom environment to the online classroom environment, we need to be very particular and purposeful about what and manageable about what we're choosing to have students engage with. So through this process, Mr. Jamison knows that he's selected the ones that students need in order to master their 10th grade standards. For the 3rd step, Mr. Jamison is going to now think about what are the formative assessments or those benchmark assessments that will help students check understanding leading to the summative assessment. He will also build any new assessments or modify any existing ones. I'll pause here in order for you to take notes on this step if necessary. So now that Mr. Jamison has gone through the process of narrowing down the learning content that he will be focusing on, he's rewritten or modified his unit summative assessment, as well as identified 2 formative assessments in the form of quizzes that will assess student learning as they work towards their final unit assessment. So that way, while students are working through their unit, he can check student understanding and make decisions about where extension would be appropriate or remediation if needed. As we move into this 4th step of this planning process, Mr. Jamison now has a very concrete and focused unit assessment with formative assessments. It's time for Mr. Jamison to think about how he will engage his students with the content and also create opportunities for them to practice the skills that they will be demonstrating on those unit assessments. At this stage, Mr. Jamison wants to consider, or needs to consider, where opportunities for accessibility should be created. So for example, if students have access to online technology at home, of course he can't support all of the factors that go on or variables that happen at home that might be out of his control, but considering how to include opportunities for access for students so that students have equity when it comes to these learning experiences. Also in terms of students who might be English language learners or students with disabilities. The screen time that students will be engaging in. The consistency of the experiences and the information that's being given. And the authenticity or the validity of the learning experiences that students are engaging in, ensuring that they are meaningful so that students are getting the most out of the time that they're spending online learning. And I'll just pause here for any notes that you might be taking. So in Mr. Jameson's class, what this might look like, or what this looks like for his Global 10 class, is thinking through what are 8 activities or 8 possible activities that students would need to go through in order to work towards that final performance task. In this case, it includes opportunities for close reading and stations where students are exploring the new content around World War I. Engaging in the writing process where students are pre-writing or organizing their research, drafting according to the performance task guidelines, engaging in peer revisions and feedback, as well as also videotaping, in this case, their briefs, which were according to that unit assessment. So we thought about some purposeful activities that students can engage in to help develop their understanding by engaging with the content and practicing their skills. Now, in step 5, Mr. Jameson is going to think about what are the materials that he has on hand in order to support building his online community and giving materials to students. He's going to go through another inventory period where he's thinking about what materials does he have, what might he need to find or curate, and which ones might need to be created, especially since we are moving some materials from paper or hard copy onto the digital platform. I'm just pausing here for any notes you might be taking. And just to reiterate, if this is not enough time for you to take notes, all of this information is also available within the organizer. These guiding questions are here, so that way you can follow the guiding questions to support your own planning. So what Mr. Jameson did is he created a table where it says have, find, and create, and some resources that he might be looking to see what he has or take inventory of are any videos that might be needed, readings or discussion questions, any worksheet outs, project materials, or rubrics that might be needed in order to start identifying the scope of the work that may need to be done in order to transition to this online community. And in this last stage, step 6, it's time to think about how these materials are going to be digitally organized to support students' learning experience. This is where Mr. Jameson starts to think about if learning is going to be this synchronous or asynchronous, whether students are doing the learning at the same time or if they're engaging in learning at their own pace or at different times. So how Mr. Jameson is going to organize his class, he's really thinking about wanting to communicate this information to students so that way they know the expectations while they're engaging in their online community, what assignments they're going to have so they can plan their time appropriately, when meetings are going to be held, and how learning is going to take place. So whether or not students are engaging as a whole class and need to be available to go into a virtual meeting, or if these assignments are done at home and when they'll be due. So he's taken the assignments that he had planned and also thought about, like we discussed in the beginning of the webinar, the naming conventions, how they might be presented. So each time an assignment is presented, it's named similarly to the last one. So that way, when learners are getting used to their online platform, They have visual cues to know when it's an assignment versus when it's a quiz or when it's the end of unit performance task. This type of schedule is something that could be posted to students and sent home to parents. So transparency in learning is there for all members involved. So at this stage, Mr. Jameson has gone through the 6 steps to help plan. He's been able to identify the most important information that's needed for students to be successful, so he knows the instruction that he's giving to students are quality and meaningful for them. Now he's able to think about and dive deeper into building his online community using different technology tools that he is available to him. We're now going to transition to the Q&A session of this webinar. So using the Q&A feature, like you've been doing so far, if you could please submit any questions you have, and we will moderate and answer those questions as a whole group.
Also note that I just posted the exemplar organizer that we use as our planning tool. As a Google Doc. As you open it, it will require you to make a copy. So although we do have the slide deck, you'll also be able to go through that document just to kind of see what this looks like when it comes to your planning time. But we'll give you a couple seconds to write down any questions. We'll spend about another 10 minutes or so answering those questions, and then we'll wrap it up from there. So the first question we have is, do you see an issue with trying to go synchronous school-wide and try to follow a modified daily schedule? So it's a good question. I think when it comes to the discussion of synchronous learning, it really depends on so many factors. Number one, are you comfortable as a teacher to deliver synchronous instruction? Number two, do you have the tools available and do you know how to use those tools as well as your students? Number three, are you able to make it smaller group instruction versus larger group, depending on what your class size is? When it comes to that modified daily schedule, I know that some districts are going to, let's say, 2 hours of instruction. Maybe you want 30 minutes as just touching base with your students, answering questions, and that's where your synchronous learning is coming into play. And then students are doing their asynchronous learning the rest of the week. It really depends on what your learning goals are as well. For example, if you want kids to come together to have a discussion, maybe synchronous learning is the best tool. Other times, maybe students working separately or in smaller groups with each other is also good. So for example, maybe you want group A to meet on Mondays and you drop into that group to discuss content with them. It really just depends on what your learning goals are.
I would just like to add to that, as school administrators, coaches, or teacher leaders who are supporting in that planning at a whole school level, I think one of the more important aspects is being able to communicate a clear schedule. So that same consistency that we've been speaking about through the webinar, in order for it to be successful, making sure that everybody knows exactly where they would need to be, when, and how to access that synchronous community would be extremely important, especially as students start to go home and parents are maybe home from and not at work and are starting to develop their own schedules. That way people can plan ahead of time and know where to be and when, and be prepared to be present at that time you've scheduled for them as well.
Yeah, and it's a really great point. Somebody in the chat said, the issue is now that parents are working from home, you have 2 or 3 kids at home. Sometimes the Wi-Fi can't control or can't handle that amount of bandwidth. And that's a great point. So it's one thing for us as teachers to know what we have in our arsenal of tools and how we want to instruct, but also considering that there are some factors at home for students that we don't have control over, and just keeping that in the back of our mind when it comes to things like synchronous learning, as well as some students may not have parents at home to sit with them to go through some of these activities. And we'll kind of talk about that as we go through some of these questions. One question we have is, what are your tips for timing as far as how long instructional videos and face-to-face instruction should be? It's a great question. I would always say, well, let me take a step back. If we look at the biology, and I love reading about neuroeducation, it's one of my nerdy moments. John Medina suggests that humans that are fully developed, full humans like us, 10 minutes. That's when their attention starts to wane. Now consider younger students at 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old. When it comes to instructional videos, I would really recommend you err on the side of caution and go from between 3 to 5 minutes, 5 minutes being extremely long. Now, that's not suggesting that that's the only learning that students are doing. Maybe that video is coupled alongside reading. Maybe that video is 3 minutes and then students go and do an activity and then they watch another video. The more that you're able to engage students and have them look at certain content, do other things and look at certain content, you'll be able to maintain that instruction longer. When it comes to face-to-face instruction, I would go along the same lines of that amount of time. So for example, if I'm instructing synchronously, I might want to do my 10-minute mini lesson and then have students go work and then come back together. It really depends on your learning goals, but in theory, the shorter, the better to maintain effective and clear communication. Also remember that this is new for students as well. So the more that we can make this, make the content less of a cognitive load, and what I mean by that is they're not only accessing now, they're having to learn content and skill, as well as now access this in a whole new format. The brain is going to be doing a lot of different things. So keep that in the back of your mind. But also consider the screen time that students should have when it comes to the younger students in particular. In many cases, students should not be online for extended periods of time. In fact, I actually pulled a research article that gives you some of those numbers that I'll drop into the, as soon as I can find it, I'll drop into the chat. But consider that so that students aren't just staring at the computer. That's a great question. Erin, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say always defer to your district guidelines. Many districts are coming out with what they require, recommend based on state laws. So err on the caution of whatever your district is recommending as well.
Yes, good point. Thank you, Erin. And that also is in reference to your what you're allowed to do with kids online. So just be sure that you follow those guidelines as you go. So we got a couple questions about how does special ed work during in a situation like this? What do you recommend when you're a paraprofessional and you're delivering one-to-one instruction? So Erin, I'm actually going to defer to you on this one.
Yeah, so I'm a special education teacher. So this is a great question. I think there are a lot of opportunities to support different types of students. I know the question is directed specifically at paraprofessionals. Thinking about though, when you're doing your planning and you're crafting your materials, where do students need opportunities for extra practice? So extra practice at all points are necessary for all students, but specifically students with disabilities. Where can you create those opportunities for them to practice more? Have directions that are broken down and digestible for students who might struggle with any processing or need support around multi-step directions. With one-to-one instruction, if it's something the parents have agreed to, that's where video chats can be incredibly useful. But even if you don't have video chat available to you, I think staying connected with our students is so important. Letting them know that we are a pipeline of communication and questions. So kind of establishing a place where students can go to submit those questions to you. And if you're a special education teacher or paraprofessional, also having yourself be available to all your students, not just those that maybe you work with one-to-one. So that way students know that they always have a connection back to their school and can feel comfortable asking questions that they may not feel comfortable asking in a public environment like a Google Classroom space.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, we have time for a couple more questions. So the next two questions are actually very similar or a similar answer. So one is, as an art teacher, how can you suggest the best format for students to submit visual pictures of their artwork? And in my opinion, that goes very similarly to the question of, for the youngest learners, K through 2, what are the best online tools that we can use? So when it comes to visual work, and then I would argue for your K through 2 students, a lot of times they're going to be doing physical things with paper. Maybe they're writing things down. Maybe they're printing things off if they have that ability. Having students take pictures and post it on Google Classroom or Microsoft Teams if that's what you use. Having students film 30-second reflections by showing their pictures, or using their phones to have a conversation with you if that's within your district guidelines. Any way that you can have students use their multimedia, and trust me, kids are so good with video. They're good with TikTok, they're good with social media. So to post pictures and to post videos, drop it into a Google slide deck or drop it into a PowerPoint and reflect with a text as well, are some of the different ways that you can have students show their visual artwork that may not actually be that physical turning in, as well as for those younger students where you want them to work on their writing. They're not going to necessarily be able to do that digitally. So maybe parents are taking pictures and there's going to be support there. Now we understand that there's not always support at home. So that brings us to another point, is that doing a webinar similar to this with your parents, or at least pushing out frequently asked questions or your new digital routines and norms. Think back to the beginning of the school year when you have back to school night. And the purpose of that night is to explain how the school year is going to work, what your norms are, what your routines are, what the teachers, what the parents can expect. This is even more uncharted territory for many parents who never learned online, and some did for sure. But no matter what, having to work with their kids in an online setting is new to them. So opening that pipeline, like Erin said, of communication between the students and you, as well as the parents and you, is going to be very important. But also opening that pipeline of communication between you and your admin, as well as other like-minded educators. What I'm loving to see in a lot of these webinars that we've done is the amount of resource and experience that teachers are posting in the chat. And I think it's so important to get connected in your personal learning network on Twitter. Find Facebook groups to join. Make a Google Classroom or a Microsoft Team for your school, and have your professional learning community share out resources that they're using, as well as different tools that they're using. But I want to encourage all of you to use things that you're comfortable with. Just because one teacher is using Flipgrid and is using online technology and using all of these different things doesn't mean that you have to. In many cases, creating hyperdocs, creating documents with some links is where we're at, and that is totally okay. At this point, we are just trying to have our students continue learning. And as we go through this scenario, and as we go through this unprecedented situation, think about the skills that you're honing as an educator, so that when we get back into school with our kids, think about how much more effective and how our online component of our classroom will now be because of this situation. So these are really fantastic questions. And Erin, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was sufficient.
Awesome. So at this point, there's no other questions in the Q&A. Just some logistical points. We did post all of the resources for you in the chat, as well as we will be posting this recording on our website in the next few days. Furthermore, if you look at our slide on the screen, please email us at info@eduscape if you have very pressing concerns and questions. We are here for you. We want to help you. So please reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You could see our handles are there at the bottom. But also, please keep your eye out for further webinars. We will be doing more technology-based webinars in the coming days. However, we really saw a need for this pedagogy piece, because all these technology pieces are fantastic, but how do you use them is where a lot of teachers were, oh my goodness, what do I do? So at this point, we'll hang out here for another couple minutes. And if you're free to go. Thank you for joining us today. We're very happy that you came to our webinar, and please reach out to us if you need us. And after you log off of the webinar, you'll receive a short evaluation. If you could, please take a couple seconds to fill that out. We do take those evaluations seriously, and we do actually hone our webinars based off of the feedback that you give us. So we appreciate it. Thank you for participating with us, and good luck. We're here for you.
Have a great day, everybody. Were there any questions we didn't answer for anybody who's still in the chat with us?
At the moment, we don't have any.
Great.
Thank you very much, everybody.